Chapter 17 of the report which Edwin Athwaite made to his chief, and of the deliberations of the Black Lodge thereupon, and the conspiracies thereby concerted with a discourse upon sorcery. Exordium mammatically deponent precatef oti oleant exordiant dolor-brasciales assumt, pragmatics ex ventro geniesiaco ad umbilicum apolicticum determined logomachipos nodal punx genealogically benedict eschatologically cacloglog phiotopical moaetic apert parthenon ho do articulal colophoned thanatos kian comorphic. First I beg herein increasingly favourable royal's gift, assumption, facts, from beginning to end, mark my story's limits, at first fortunate, later in a bad hole, work, fatal, opened, like the rosy fingers of a maid, closed, in the shape of the valley of the shadow of death. With these striking words the official report of Douglas's chief commissioner began. It would be tedious to quote the 488 folio pages in full. Douglas himself did not read it. The transcript made by Vesquet of Abdul Bey's inspiration, with a few practical questions to the latter, told him all that he needed. Audience over, he dismissed Athwaite and his companion with orders to hold themselves in readiness for a renewal of the campaign. Douglas had many a moment of bitter contemplation. His hatred of Cyril Grey fed upon repulse, and it was evident that his assistants had met more than their match. He would have to act personally, yet he feared to expose himself in open battle. His plan hitherto had been to bribe or dupe some of the jackal journalists of London to attack him, but Grey had not so much as troubled to bring libel actions. But he would not give in. He studied Vesquet's transcripts attentively and with indecision. He did not know how far to trust the oracle, and he did not understand how Vesquet had come to die, since on that point even Athwaite had been silent. The demons whom he consulted were emphatic in favour of the document, but failed to explain how the fortress was to be reduced from the inside. He was clear in his mind as to the nature of Grey's operation. He saw perfectly that Lissa herself was the weak point in it, but he did not see how to get at her. He continued in his bitter mood until the early hours, and he was interrupted by the return of his wife from her miserable night's trudging. She put 2 francs on the table without a single word as soon as she entered. "Is that all?" snarled Douglas. "You ought to be getting 5s again now spring's coming, though you're not as pretty as you were." He garnished this greeting with garlic of low abuse. Rarely to any other person did he use even mild oaths. He affected the grand manner, but he knew that foulness of speech emphasized his wife's degradation. He had no need of the vile money that she earned. He had 1,000 better means of buying whisky, but he drove her to the streets as no professional souteneur would have dared to. By extreme refinement of cruelty he never struck or kicked her, lest she should think he loved her. To him she was a toy, a means of exercising his passion for torture. To her he was the man she loved. Pitifully she pleaded that the cold rain of the night, she was wet through, had driven all Paris from the boulevard to the café, and she added an excuse for her unattractiveness which should have sent her husband to his pistol for very shame had a spark of manhood or memory of his mother been alive within him. Instead, he promised to change all that the next time Dr. Ballop came to Paris. He had systematically degraded and humiliated her, corrupted her, branded her with infamy for many a year, yet there was still in her a motion of revolt against the crime. But even as she made her gesture of repulsion, Douglas leapt to his feet, with the light of hell burning in his eyes. "I have it!" he shouted. "Get to your straw, you stinking slut, and you may thank your stars that as you can't be ornamental, you're going to be useful." It was dawn before Douglas turned into bed, for his great idea brought with it a flood of imagination and a million problems of detail. The servant girl was already half dressed for the day's work, and he made her fetch him a final whisky before he slept. Late in the following afternoon he woke, and sent Kremers, whom he had turned into a drudge, to telegraph to Ballock to come over and to bring her friend Butcher to see him. Douglas had previously refused to see this man, who was a Chicago semi-tough. He ran a fake Rosicrucian society in America and thought that Douglas could give him power over the elusive dollars. But Douglas had found no use for him. He rather insisted on respectability in his neophytes. It was only in the higher grades that one found the disreputable. It was an obvious point of policy, but Douglas had now remembered one little fact about this person. He fitted the great idea so nicely that his presence in Paris seemed to act as an answer to prayer. It was a rare, if doubtful, privilege to visit Douglas in his home. He never allowed the visit of any but those high in his confidence. The locality was hardly inspiring to an inquiring duchess. He had 2 other places in Paris, which he used for 2 types of interviewer, for although he discouraged knowledge of his authority in the Black Lodge, he did a good deal of the fishing himself, especially with rich or highly placed people, for his subordinates had sticky fingers. One of these places was a discreet apartment in the very best quarter of Paris. Here he was the Scottish nobleman of the old school. The decorations were rich but not gaudy. Even the ancestors were not overdone. The place of honour was occupied by Rob Raw's claymore alleged. One of his claims was that the Highland Cateran was his ancestor, owing to a liaison with a fairy. Another claim was that he himself was James the Fourth of Scotland, that he had survived the Battle of Flodden Field, became an adept, and immortal. Despite what to a profane mind might seem the incompatibility of these 2 legends, to say nothing of the improbability of either, they were greedily swallowed by the Theosophist section of his following. In this apartment he received the credulous type of person who is impressed by rank, and no man could play the part of stateliness better than his old reprobate. His other place was of the hermit's cell model, a tiny cottage with its well-kept garden, such abound all over Paris in the most unexpected spots. He actually imposed upon the old lady who kept this house for him. Here he was simply an old man of utter holiness, the lonely recluse, the saintly anchorite, his only food bruised herbs or pulse, his only drink the same as quenched the thirst of Father Adam. His long absences from this sacrosanct abode was explained by the fact of his absorption in trance, in which he was supposed to indulge underground. Of course he only visited the place when he had to receive a certain type of visitor, that loftier type which has enough rank and wealth to know that they are not necessary to a search after truth, and is impressed by simplicity and saintliness. It was at the formal address that the Count received Mr. Butcher. He was dressed in severe and refined broadcloth, with the rosette of the Legion of Honour, to which he was well entitled, in his buttonhole. In presence of this splendour, the American was ill at ease, but Douglas knew how to make a man his own by giving him a good conceit of himself. "I am proud to meet you, Mr. Butcher," he began affably. "May I beg of you to take the trouble to be seated? The chair is worthy of you," he added with a smile. "It was at one time the property of Frederick the Great." The servant, who was dressed as a Highland gillie in gala costume, offered cigars and whisky. "Say, this is sure some whisky, Count. This is where I fall off the wagon one time, John. You match my battling average," observed Mr. Butcher, settling himself by placing his legs upon the table. "It was from the private stock of the Duke of Argyll," returned Douglas. "And you, Mr. Butcher? I knew a Count Butcher many years ago. You are a relative?" Mr. Butcher had only the vaguest notion as to his ancestry. His mother had broken down under cross-examination. "Search me," he replied, biting the end off his cigar and spitting it out. "We Rosicrucians are out for the 100 Years' Club dope and the long green stone. We should worry. We're short in ancestors in Illinois." "But these matters are important in magic," urged Douglas. "Heredity goes for much. I should be glad indeed to hear that you are one of the Dorsetshire butchers, for example, or even the Shropshire branch. In both families, second sight is an appanage." Here the conversation was interrupted by the gillie. "I crave your pardon, my lord," he said, bowing, "but his Grace the Duke of Hants is at the door to beg your aid in a most urgent matter which concerns his family honour." "I am engaged," said Douglas. "He may write." The man withdrew with a solemn bow. I must apologise for this disturbance, continued Douglas. The importunity of one's clients is exceedingly distressing. It is one of our penalties. I venture to suppose that you are yourself much annoyed in similar ways. Butcher would have liked to boast that J.P. Morgan was always trying to borrow money from him, but he dared not attempt to bluff his host. Nor did he suspect that Douglas was himself engaged in that diverting and profitable pastime. To come to business, went on Douglas, eyeing his guest narrowly, and ensuring himself that his scheme had borne fruit in due season. What is it that you require of me? Frankly, I like you, and I have long admired your noble career. All that I can do for you in honour, pray count, is done. Why count, said Mr. Butcher, spitting on the floor. Butinsky's in Kalasmoral, but to come down to brass tacks, I guess I'd like to sit into the game. I pray you to excuse me, replied Douglas, but my long residence in Paris has almost deprived me of the comprehension of my mother tongue. Could you explain yourself further? Why, this Black Lodge stunt, Count. It's a humdinger. I guess it's a hell of a favour, but I see $1 at the end of it, an old dock. Butcher buys a one-way ticket. Douglas grew portentous. Are you aware of what you ask? He thundered. Do you understand that the ineffable and sanctus-ranked arcanum is not to be touched by profane hands? Must I inform you that those who may not be named are even now at the gate of the abyss, whetting their fangs upon the cubical stone of the unutterable? O ye magistral ministrants of the shrine of the unspeakable abomination, hear ye the word of blasphemy. He spoke rapidly and thickly in a tongue unknown to Butcher, who became alarmed and even took his legs off the table. Say, he cried, have a heart. Can the rough dope count? This is a straight proposition, honest to God. I am already aware of your sincerity, answered the other, but infinite courage is required to confront those formidable entities that lie in wait for the seeker, even at the first portal of the descending staircase. Oh, I'm wise to the old dog Cerberus. Ishkirabillable. Give me an upper berth in the Chicago walk. St. Louis and Hell Limited. If it busts the roll, do you get me, Steve? I understand you to say that you persist in your application. Sure. Andrew P. Satan for mine. I shall be pleased to place your name before the watchers of the gate. How do I have to dig? Dig? I did not quite catch your remark. In the wad. Weigh the dole. What does it set me back? Me for the breadline. The initiation fee is 1,000 francs. I guess I can skin that off without having to eat at Child's. You will remit the amount to the controller of my privy purse. Here is the address. Now be so good as to sign the preliminary application form. They went over to the bureau. Douglas was prepared to derive it from the library of Louis XIV, on which lay a private letter from the Kaiser, if one might believe the embossed arms and address, and a note asking President Poincaré to dinner. Quite informally, my dear friend, which Butcher could not fail to see. The preliminary application form was a document which might have served for an exceptionally solemn treaty, but Douglas was above the charlatanism of requiring a signature in blood. Butcher signed it with an ordinary fountain pen. And now, Mr. Butcher, said Douglas, I would ask you in your turn to render me a small service. Bat it up, said Mr. Butcher. I would buy an illustrated edition of O. Henry in 19 parts. Douglas did not know that Americans dread book agents more than rattlesnakes, but he gathered that his guest would acquiesce in any reasonable suggestion. I am informed that you are or were a priest of the Roman Church. Peter is my middle name, admitted the Rosicrucian, and that's no jolly. But apart from questions of nomenclature, for the moment, if you will pardon me, you are a priest of the Roman Church? Yep, I took a chance on Pop Dago Benedict, but it's a con game. I'm from Missouri. 4 Flushing gold brick merchants. Believe me, some ball. I took it like playing 3 days in Bumville. Them boobs got my gold for fair, babe. No pipe. You were interdicted in consequence of some scandal? I ran a sporting house on the side, and I guess they endorsed my licence for speeding. Your bishop took umbrage at some business activity which he judged incompatible with your vows. Like Kelly did. Oh, Bishop Kelly. Far too severe a disciplinarian, in my judgment. But you are still a priest. Your orders are still valid. A baptism or a marriage performed by you would hold good. It's a cinch. The Hallelujah Guarantee and Trust Company, St. Paul offices in the James D. Athanasius building. Then, sir, I shall ask of you the favour to hold yourself in readiness to baptize 2 persons at 9 of the evening precisely, the day after tomorrow. That ceremony will be followed by another, in which you will marry them. I swan. I may rely on your good offices. I'll come in a wheelbarrow. Suit yourself, Mr. Butcher, as to the mode of transport, but pray be careful to attend punctually and in canonical costume. I'll dig the beretta out of the icebox. After a further exchange of courtesies, the new disciple took his leave. The same evening witnessed a very different interview. Lord Anthony Boleyn was being entertained at dinner by Simon If, and their conversation turned upon the favourite subject of the old mystic, the way of the Tao. In view of what you've been saying about the necessity of dealing with mediums on their own ground, remarked the host, let me tell you of a paradox in magic. Do you remember a certain chapter in the Bible which tells one, almost in consecutive verses, firstly to answer a fool according to his folly, and secondly not so to answer him? This is the scriptural version of a truth which we phrase otherwise. There are 2 ways of dealing with an opponent, one by beating him on his own ground, the other by withdrawing to a higher plane. You can fight fire with fire, or you can fight fire with water. It is, roughly speaking, legitimate magic to resolve a difficult situation in either of these 2 ways. Alter it, or withdraw to higher ground. The black magician, or as I prefer to call him, sorcerer, for the word magic should not be profaned, invariably withdraws to lower planes. Let us seek an analogy in the perfectly concrete case of the bank cashier. This gentleman, we will assume, finds his salary inadequate to his outgoings. Now he may economise, that is, withdraw himself to a kind of life where money is no longer needed in such quantity. Or he may devote himself day and night to his business, and so increase his salary. But there is no third course open to a man of self-respect. The sorcerer type of man appeals to lower planes of money-making. He begins by gambling. Beaten there, he resorts to the still viler means of embezzlement. Perhaps finally he attempts to cover his thefts by murdering his mother for the insurance money. Notice how, as his plane becomes debased, his fears grow greater. At first he is merely annoyed about his creditors. In the next stage he fears being sharped by his fellow gamblers. Then it is the police who loom terrible in his mind. And lastly the grim form of the executioner threatens him. Very nicely hogarthed, said Lord Anthony. Reminds me of how the habit of lying degenerates into unintelligible stupidity. We had a case in the West Office last month, a matter of supplying certain furs. As you know, the seal furnishes a valuable fur. Less valuable, though superficially similar, is that of the rabbit. Now in trade, so it appears, it is impolitic to say rabbit, which sounds cheap and nasty, so the scriptural equivalent, coney, is employed, thus combining piety with profit. Having caught your coney, you proceed to cook him until he resembles seal. So you have a dyed rabbit skin, and you call it seal coney. But there are byways that stray further yet from the narrow lane of truth. The increasing demand for rabbits has reduced the profit on seal coney, and it becomes desirable to find a cheaper substitute. Reckless of the susceptibilities of the ancient Egyptians, this is found in that domesticated representative of the lion family which consoles our spinsters. Having disguised the skin as far as may be, they next disguise the name. Some buyer must be made to pay the price of seal coney, and think that he is getting it, so cat becomes trade seal coney, and unless one has the whole story, there is no possibility of derivation. The lie has become mere misnomer. It is the general case of Anglo-Saxon hypocrisy, returned Simon If. I had an amusing example the other day in an article that I wrote for the Review. Rather prudish people. My little essay ended, so science offers her virgin head to the caress of magic. The editor thought virgin rather a suggestive word and replaced it by maiden. You remind me of a curate we had over at Grimthorpe Ambrose. Leg has for many years been a not quite proper word. When the terrible necessity of referring to it arose, the polite ass replaced it by limb. The refined sensibility of our curate perceived the indelicacy of saying limb, since everyone knew that it meant leg, so he wrapped it up in the decent obscurity of the Latin language, and declined to play croquet one afternoon on the ground that, the day before, in visiting old Mrs. Postlethwaite, he had severely strained his member. "The wicked fall into the pit that they have digged," said If. "All this applies to the question of magic. It is a question of debasing coinage. I have great sympathy with the ascetics of India and their monkish imitators in Europe. They held spiritual gifts to be of supreme value, and devoted their lower powers to the development of the higher. Of course mistakes were made. The principle was carried too far. They were silly enough to injure their lower powers by undue fasting, flagellation, and even mutilation. They got the false idea that the body was an enemy, whereas it is a servant, the only servant available. But the idea was right. They wanted to exchange dross for gold. Now the sorcerer offers his gold for dross, tries to exchange his higher powers for money or the gratification of envy or revenge. The Christian Scientist, absurdly so called, is a sorcerer of the basest type, for he devotes the whole wealth of religion to the securing of his bodily health. It is somewhat stupid, too, as his main claim is that the body is only an illusion. Am I right in suggesting that ordinary life is a mean between these extremes, that the noble man devotes his material wealth to lofty ends, the advancement of science or art or some such true ideal, and that the base man does the opposite by concentrating all his abilities on the amassing of wealth? Exactly. That is the real distinction between the artist and the bourgeoisie, or, if you prefer it, between the gentleman and the cad. Money and the things money can buy have no value, for there is no question of creation, but only of exchange. Houses, lands, gold, jewels, even existing works of art may be tossed about from one hand to another. They are so constantly. But neither you nor I can write a sonnet, and what we have, our appreciation of art, we did not buy. We inherited the germ of it, and we developed it by the sweat of our brows. The possession of money helped us, but only by giving us time and opportunity and the means of travel. Anyhow, the principle is clear. One must sacrifice the lower to the higher, and as the Greeks did with their own, one must fatten and bedeck the lower, so that it may be the worthier offering. And what happens when you go on to the other track? When you trade your gold for pewter, you impoverish yourself. The sorcerer sells his soul for money, spends the money, and finds he has nothing else to sell. Have you noticed that Christian Scientists are hardly ever in robust health? They have given up their spiritual forces for a quite imaginary standard of well-being, and those forces which were supporting the body quite well enough without their stupid interference are debilitated and frittered away. I pray daily for a great war that may root out the coward fear of death and poverty in the minds of these degenerate wretches. Death should be, as it used to be in the Middle Ages, even and yet more in pagan times, the fit reward and climax of a life well spent in risking it for noble causes, and poverty should be a holy and blessed state, worthy of the highest minds and the happiest, and of them alone. To return to our sheep, I mean our sorcerer, he has not much against him to begin with, but he chooses to trade his sword for gold. The barbarian, having the sword, naturally uses it to recover the gold. In other words, the devil, having bought the soul, regains the price, for the sorcerer spends it in the devil's service. The next stage is that the sorcerer resorts to crime, declares war on all humanity. He uses vulgar means to attain his ends, and the price may be his liberty. Ultimately, he may lose life itself in some last desperate effort to retrieve all at a blow. When I was young and had less experience, I had many a fight with sorcerers, and it was always the end of the fight when Mr. Sorcerer broke the law. He was no longer fighting me, but the consolidated will of humanity, and he had no time to attack me when he was busy building the breakwaters. And that reminds me, we have a young friend at bay with the worst pack of devils in the world at him. I wonder if I've done wrong to leave him so much to himself. But I wanted the boy to gain all the laurels. He's young enough to like them. I think I know who you mean, said Lord Anthony, smiling, and I don't think you need to be very much afraid. I never saw anyone much better fitted to take care of himself. For all that, he's in urgent danger at this very moment. He has incurred the greatest possible risk. He has gained a victory. But it has been only a clash of outposts. The enemy is coming up now. Horse, foot, and artillery, with lust of revenge and desperate fear to inflame the original hatred, and unfortunately the boy made some fundamental errors in his plan of campaign. Oh well, Napoleon did that. General was the result of his own blustering miscalculations, so to a certain extent was Austerlitz. Don't fret, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, as my father's pet pugilist used to say. And now I must run away. There is a séance with a lady who materializes demon slugs. Do not forget to inscribe my name among the martyrs. Chapter 18. The Dark Side of the Moon. The spring gathered her garments together, then flung them wide over the Bay of Naples. Hers is the greatest force in nature, because her clarion sounds the summons of creation. It is she that is the vicegerent of the All-Father, and of his spirit hath he dowered her with the triple essence. In southern lands, even before the equinox opens its gates before her conquering armies, one feels her imminent. Her light-armed troops swarm over the breached ramparts of the winter, and their cries echoed in the dungeons of the soul by those whom she has come to save. Yet in her hands is nothing but a sword. It is a disturbance of the equilibrium to which the dying year has attained after its long joy and agony, and so to the soul which is at ease she comes with alarum and tosci. A soul like Iliel's, naturally apt to receive every impulse, to multiply it, and to transform it into action, is peculiarly sensitive, without knowing it, to cosmic forces so akin to its own inborn turbulence. In her idlest moods, Lissa la Giuffria would have started for China at the least provocation, provided that she could start within the hour. She could take a lover, or throw one away, 12 times in a year, and would have been indignant and amazed if anyone had called her fickle. She was not insincere, but she believed with her whole soul that her immediate impulse was the true will of her whole self. One night at the Savoy Hotel with Lavinia King, just before Christmas, the talk had turned on the distress then prevailing in London. Instantly she had dragged the whole party downstairs, provided it with the entire supply of silver money that the hotel happened to have on hand, and rushed it to the Embankment to rescue the unemployed. That night she was a super Shaftesbury. She formulated 12 plans to solve the problem of poverty, root, branch, and leaf, and the next morning her dressmaker found her amid a sheaf of calculations. But a new style of costume being displayed, she had plunged with equal ardour into a cosmopolitan scheme of dress reform. To such a one a thwarted impulse involves almost a wreckage of the soul. Iliel began openly to chaff at the restrictions to which her own act had bound her. She had never been a mother, and the mere physical disabilities of her condition were all the more irritating because they were so unfamiliar. The excitement of the butterfly chase had kept her toe to the mark, and the strange circumstances with which she was surrounded had aided to make it easy for her. It flattered her vanity that she was the keystone of so great an arch, destined to span earth and heaven. Her new conditions, the relaxation of the tension, threw down her exaltation. The experiment was over. Well, then it ought to be over, and she had months of boredom before her, which must be endured with no stimulus but that of normal human duty. She was one of those people who will make any sacrifice at the moment, beggar themselves to help a friend, but who are quite incapable of drawing a weekly cheque for a trifling sum for no matter how important a purpose. In this March and April she was one mass of thwarted impulse. The mere necessity, demanded by safety, of remaining within the circle was abhorrent to her, but though she did not know it, she was held in subjection by the wills of her guardians. In astrology, the moon, among its other meanings, has that of the common people who submit, they know not why, to an independent will that can express itself with sufficient energy. The people who guillotined the mild Louis XVI died gladly for Napoleon. The impossibility of an actual democracy is due to this fact of mob psychology. As soon as you group men, they lose their personalities. A parliament of the wisest and strongest men in the nation is liable to behave like a set of schoolboys, tearing up their desks and throwing their inkpots at each other. The only possibility of cooperation lies in discipline and autocracy, which men have sometimes established in the name of equal rights. Now Iliel was at present a microcosm of the moon, and her resentments were either changed into enthusiasms by a timely word from Sister Clara or one of the others, or else ignored. The public is a long-suffering dumb beast, an ass crouching beneath heavy burdens, and it needs not only unendurable ill-treatment, but leadership before it will revolt. All Iliel's impulses were purposeless, negative things, ideas rather of escape than of any definite programme. She wanted to jump out of the frying pan, neither fearing the fire nor having any clear idea of how to act when she got there. She lacked so much as a daydream of any alternative future. Hers was the restless wretchedness of a morphine use deprived of the drug. She was, as it were, the place where four winds met, and such a place is dangerous for a ship that is without internal means of propulsion. She sagged, a dismasted derelict, in tow of Cyril Grey, and the rope of love which held her to him strained her creaking timbers. The first evidence of these very indefinite feelings was shown by her unreasonableness. Under the rigid discipline of her ceremonies, she had been too well schooled, too absorbed, too directly under the influence of the forces invoked, to feel or express constraint. The mere human hygiene of her present position served only to make her more discontented. A similar phenomenon has been observed also with democracies. They are happiest when most thoroughly cowed and bullied. Once or twice she treated Cyril to an outburst of temper, but he was very young, so he was tactless enough to refuse to be angry, and made every allowance for her. Such treatment insults women like Lissa. Their rage smoulders in them. A blow and a caress would have tripled her passion for him. "What is the use of being a Chinese god," she might have asked, "if you do not gratify your worshippers by inflicting Chinese tortures?" But the principal manifestation of her moral instability was in her whims. These were in some degree, no doubt, due to her physical condition, but the mental stress exaggerated them to an abnormal height, like a glacier cramped between two mountain chains. It is necessary in this world to be made of harder stuff than one's environment. But Iliel had no ambition to any action. She was reflex, simple reaction to impression was what she thought her will. And so she inflicted fantasies upon the patient fold about her. One day she was all for dressing herself strangely, another day she would insist upon a mask or a charade, but she took no true pleasure in any of these things. Cyril Grey was assiduous in meeting her desires. There were but two prohibitions left of all the elaborate restrictions of the second stage of the experiment. She might not be unduly intimate with him, and she might not in any way communicate with the outside world. In other words, the citadel and the ramparts must be kept intact, because there was a wide range for rim. Yet she was not content. It was just these two forbidden things that haunted her. The serpent is a later invention in the story of the fall. Her unconscious wish to violate these rules led to a dislike for those who personified their rigidity, namely Cyril Grey and Brother Onofrio, and her febrile mind began to join these separate objects in a common detestation. This showed itself in a quite insane jealousy of their perfectly natural and necessary intimacy. Sometimes, as they sat sunning themselves upon the wall of one of the terraces, she would come flaming down the garden with some foolish tale, and Brother Onofrio at least could not wholly hide his annoyance. He was naturally anxious to make all he could out of the presence of the more advanced adept, and his inborn ecclesiastical contempt for women showed through the tissue of his good manners. Cyril's most admirable patience tried her even more sorely. "Are you my lover or my grandfather?" she screamed at him one night, when he had been more than usually tactful. Had the matter rested there, it had been ill enough with her. But the mind of man is a strange instrument. Satan finds some mischief still for idle hands to do. It's a rattling good piece of psychology. Iliel had nothing to occupy her mind, because she had never trained herself to concentrate the current of her thoughts on one thing, and off all others. A passion for crochet work had saved many a woman from the streets or the river, and as on marshes methane forms, and will o' the wisp lures peasants to their oozy doom, so in the idle mind monsters are bred. She began to suffer from a real insanity of the type of persecution mania. She began to imagine that Cyril and brother Onofrio were engaged in some mysterious plot against her. It was lucky that everyone in the house possessed medical knowledge and training with specialization in psychology, so that they knew precisely how to treat her. Yet in the long run, that very knowledge became a danger. The extraordinary powers of mind in certain limited directions, which insanity often temporarily confers, enabled her to see that she was regarded as in a critical mental state. She accepted the situation as a battle instead of cooperating in frank friendship, and began to manoeuvre to outwit her guardians. Those who have any experience of madness or its congeners, drug neurosis, know how infernally easy was her task. Many's the woman who, with her pocket handkerchief to her face and the tears pouring from her eyes, has confessed all to the specialist and begged him to break her of the whisky habit, the while she absorbed a pint or so of the said whisky under cover of the said pocket handkerchief. Iliel simply noted the states of mind which they thought favourable and simulated them. Peaceful absorption in nature, particularly in the moon when she was shining, pleased them, and she cultivated these states, knowing that the others never disturbed her at such times, and thus secured, she gave herself over to the most hideous thoughts. They were, in fact, the thoughts of madness. It is a strange fact that the most harmless states of mind, the most correct trains of idea, may accompany a dangerous lunacy. The difference is that the madman makes a secret of his fancies. Lord Dunsany's stories are the perfect prose jewels of a master cutter and polisher, lit by the rays of an imagination that is the godlike son of the Father of all truth and light. But if he kept them to himself, they would be the symptoms of an incurable lesion of the brain. A madman will conceal the terrible secret that today is Wednesday, perhaps because the devil told him to do so. I am he who is truth, was the boast of a great mystic, Mansur, and they stoned him for it, as they stone all men who speak truth. But had he said, "Hush, I am God," he would have been merely a maniac. So Iliel acquired the habit of spending a great part of the day in her cradle, and there indulging her mind in every possible morbidity. The very fact that she could not go on to action served to make the matter worse. It is a terrible error to let any natural impulse, physical or mental, stagnate. Crush it out, if you will, and be done with it, or fulfil it and get it out of the system, but do not allow it to remain there and petrify. The suppression of the normal sex instinct, for example, is responsible for 1,000 ills. In Puritan countries, one inevitably finds a morbid preoccupation with sex coupled with every form of perversion and degeneracy. Addiction to excess of drink and to the drug habits, which are practically unknown in Latin countries, increase one's admiration of the Anglo-Saxon temperament. Thus also Iliel's stagnant mind bred fearsome things. Hour after hour, the pageant of diseased thoughts passed through the shadowy gulfs of her chaotic spirit. Actual phantoms took shape for her, some seductive, some menacing, but even the most hideous and cruel symbols had a fierce fascination for her. There was a stag beetle with flaming eyes, a creature as big as an elephant with claws in constant motion, that threatened her continually. Horribly as this frightened her, she gloated on it, pictured its sudden plunge with those ghastly mandibles upon her flanks. Her own flatness was a source of curious, perverse pleasure to her. One of her favourite reveries was to imagine herself the centre of a group of cannibals, watch them chop off great lumps from her body and seethe them in the pot, or roast them on a spit, hissing and dripping blood and grease upon the fire. In some insane or atavistic confusion of mind, this dream was always recognised as being a dream of love, and she understood, in some subcurrent of thought, why suffragettes force men to use violence upon them. It is but a repressed sexual instinct breaking out in race remembrance of marriage by capture. But more dangerous even than such ideas were many which she learned to group under a name which one of them gave her. It was not a name that one can transcribe in any alphabet, but it was exactly like a very short slight cough, hardly more than a clearing of the throat, a great voluntary cough of the apologetic type. She had only to make this little noise, and immediately a certain landscape opened before her. She was walking on a narrow ribbon of white path that wound up a very gentle slope. On either side of her were broad rough screes, with sparse grass and scrub between the stones. The path led up a path between two hills, and near the crest of the ridge were two towers, one on either side of the path, as if for defence. These towers were squat and very ugly, with no windows, but mere slits for archery, and they had no signs of habitation. Yet she was quite sure that something lived there, and she was conscious of the most passionate anxiety to visit whoever it might be. The moon, always in her wane, shone bright upon the path, but little of her illumination extended beyond these narrow limits. Upon the screes she could see only faint shadows, apparently of some prowling beast of the jackal or hyena type, for she could hear howling and laughing, with now and again fierce snarls and cries, as though a fight were in progress in that fell cirque. But nothing ever crossed the path itself, and she would walk along it with a sense of the most curious lightness and pleasure. It was often her intention to go to the towers, but always she was deterred from doing so by the old lady. It was at a sharp turn of the path round an immense boulder that this individual usually appeared, coming from a cleft in its face. On the first occasion she had herself greeted the old lady, asking if she could assist her. But the old lady was seated on the ground, working very hard. "May I help you," said Iliel, "in whatever you are doing?" The old lady sighed very bitterly, and said that she was trying to make a fire. "But you haven't got any sticks." "We never use sticks to make a fire in this country." The last three words were in sing-song. "Then what do you burn?" "Anything round and anything red and anything ripe in this country." "And how do you kindle it? Have you matches, or do you rub sticks together, or do you use the sun's rays through a burning glass?" "Hush! There is no phosphorus, nor any sticks, nor any sun in this country." "Then how do you get fire?" "There is no fire in this country." "But you said you were making a fire." "Trying to make a fire, my dear. We are always trying and never succeeding in this country." "And how long have you been trying?" "There is no time in this country." Iliel was half hypnotized by the reiteration of that negation and that final phrase. She began to play a game. "Well, old lady, I've something round and something red and something ripe to make your fire with. I'll give it to you if you can guess what it is." The old lady shook her head. "There's nothing round and there's nothing red and nothing ripe in this country." "Well, I'll tell you, it's an apple. If you want it, you may have it." "We never want anything in this country." "Well, I'll go on." "There's no going on in this country." "Oh, but there is, and I'm off." "Don't you know what a treasure we have in this country?" "No, what is it?" The old lady dived into the cleft of the rock and came out again in a moment with a monkey and a mousetrap and a mandolin. "I began," she explained, "with an arrow and an adder and an arquebus, but there are terrible dangers in the beginning in this country." "But what are they good for?" "Nothing at all in this country, but I'm changing them for a newt and a narwhal and a net, hoping that one day I might get to the end where one needs a zebra, a ziffer and a zarap, and one can always exchange those for something round and red and ripe in this country." It was really a sort of child's fairy story that Iliel was telling herself, but the teller was independent of her conscious mind, so that she did not know what was coming next. And really the old lady was quite a personality. On the second occasion she showed Iliel how to use her treasure. She made the monkey play the mandolin and set the mousetrap, and sure enough the newt and the narwhal, attracted by the music, swam up and were duly caught. As for the net, the old lady bartered her 3 treasures for Iliel's hair net. "I'm afraid it isn't very strong to catch things with," she said. "I only need an orange and an oboe and an octopus, and they are easy enough to catch in this country." Little by little the old lady beguiled Iliel, and one day, while they were setting a trap to catch a viper and a vineyard and a violin with their unicorn and their umbrella and their ukulele, she suddenly stopped short and asked Iliel point blank if she would like to attend the Sabbath on Walpurgis night, the eve of May Day, "for there's a short cut to it, my dear, from this country." Iliel revolted passionately against the idea, for she scented something abominable, but the old lady said, "Of course we should disguise you. It would never do for you to be recognised by Cyril and Brother Onofrio and Sister Clara. They wouldn't like to know you live in this country." "I don't," said Iliel rather angrily. "I only come out here for a walk." Ah, my dear, chuckled the old lady, but a walk's as good as a wow in this country, and you remember that the wow didn't put out Jonah where he wanted to go, but where somebody else wanted him, and that's the breed of wow we have in this country. How do you know they'd be there at Walpurgis night? A how's as good as a hen in this country, and what a hen doesn't know you may ask of a hog, and what a hog doesn't know you may ask of a horse, and what a horse doesn't know isn't worth knowing in this country. Iliel was in a black rage against her friends. Why had they not asked her to come with them? And she went back day in a vile temper. This adventure of the old lady was only one of many, but it was the most vital, because the most coherent. Indeed, it led in the end to results of importance, for Iliel agreed to go to the suburb on Walpurgis night. The old lady was very mysterious as to the method of travel. Iliel had expected conventionality on that point, but the old lady said, "There are no goats and no broomsticks in this country." Most of her visions were simply formless and incoherent horrors. Her foolish thoughts and senseless impulses took shape, usually in some distortion of an animal form, with that power of viscosity which is to vertebrates the most loathsome of all possibilities of life, since it represents the line of development which they have themselves voided, and is therefore to them excremental in character. But to Iliel's morbidity the fascination of these things was overpowering. She took an unnatural and morose delight in watching the cuttlefish squeeze itself slowly into a slime as black and oozy as the slug, and that again send trickling feelers as of leaking motor oil, greasy and repulsive, with a foul scum upon its surface, until the beast looked like some parody of a tarantula. Then this again would collapse, as if by mere weariness of struggle against gravitation, and spread itself slowly as a pool of putrefaction, which was yet intensely vital and personal by reason of its power to suck up everything within its sphere of sensation. It struck her that such creatures were images of desire, a cruel and insatiable craving depraved of any will or power to take on a single step towards gratification. And she understood that this condition was the most hideous and continual torture, agony with no ray of hope, impotence so complete as even to inhibit an issue in death. And she knew too that these shapes were born of her own weaknesses. Yet so far from rousing herself to stamp them out in her mind, she gloated upon their monstrosity and misery, took pleasure in their anguish which was her own, and fed them with the substance of her own personality and will. It was this, a spiritual nostalgie de labeur, which grew upon her like a cancer or a gangrene, treacheries of the body itself, so that the only possible remedy is instant extirpation. For once the flesh abandons its will to firmness, to organisation, and to specialised development, its degeneration into formless putrefaction becomes an accelerating rush upon a steepening slope. How tenuous is the thread by which man climbs to the stars! What concentration of the subconscious will of the race, through 1,000 generations, has determined his indomitable ascent! A single slackness, a single false step, and he topples into the morass wherein his feet still plash. Degeneration is the most fatally easy of all human possibilities. For the fell tug of cosmic inertia, that pressure of the entire universe which tends to the homogeneous, is upon man continuously, and becomes constantly more urgent the more he advances upon his path of differentiation. It is more than a fable. Atlas, who supports the universe upon his shoulders, and Hercules, the type of the man, divinely born indeed, who must yet regain Olympus by his own fierce toil, taking upon himself that infinite load. The price of every step of progress is uncounted, even in myriads of lives self-sacrificed, and every man who is unfaithful to himself is not only at war with the sum of things, but his own comrades turn upon him to destroy him, to crush out his individuality and energy, to assimilate him to their own pullulating mass. It is indeed the power of the Roman Empire which erects the cross and Calvary, but there must needs be Caiaphas and Herod, so blind that they crush out their own one hope of salvation from that iron tyranny, and also a traitor among those who once left all and followed the Son of Man. And who shall deny true Godhead to humanity, seeing that no generation of mankind has been without a Saviour, conscious of his necessary doom, and resolute to meet it, his face set as a flint towards Jerusalem.